The 5th of August 1957, 70,000 feet above the Earth, a slender winged aircraft glided silently across the Soviet Union's vast northern frontier. To the radar operators stationed in Murmansk, it was invisible until it wasn't. Blips appeared, then vanished. Signals fluttered, blinked, and froze. Something was up there, but it was too high, too fast, too faint. Below, an entire Soviet missile division bristled to life. Orders crackled over encrypted lines. MiG fighters scrambled from secret airfields. Surface-to-air missile crews locked onto sectors with trembling fingers. But the enemy was already gone. Because what they were chasing wasn't a bomber. It wasn't a fighter. It wasn't even a threat in the conventional sense. It was a camera with wings. This was the U-2, a ghost in the sky. It carried no bombs, no missiles, no countermeasures, only a 6-foot lens, rolls of film, and a flight profile so high that Soviet interceptors couldn't reach it, and Soviet radar couldn't consistently track it. And in a single pass, it shattered illusions that Soviet commanders had spent years building. Inside its camera bay was photographic evidence of something unthinkable. The USSR's so-called missile superiority was a bluff. The launch pads that were supposed to be everywhere? Empty fields. The ICBM farms boasted in propaganda films? Silent, with only prototypes. The radar arrays hidden in Siberian forests? Exposed in crisp black and white. The U-2 wasn't just mapping terrain. It was unmasking the myth. Thousands of miles away, inside a locked CIA viewing room in Washington, analysts would soon unspool that very film. What they saw would cause the entire U.S. strategic doctrine to pivot. The feared missile gap was a lie. The Soviet nuclear threat had been exaggerated, miscounted, and most damningly believed by their own leadership. Back in Moscow, the generals would scream. The Politburo would demand explanations, and every SAM operator in the Soviet Union would begin to understand. They had been blind. The Cold War had entered a new phase, not of rockets, but of revelation, not of detonations, but of exposure. The U-2 didn't fire a shot, but it detonated the most powerful weapon in intelligence history, truth. In the early 1950 seconds, Washington was paralyzed by a single phrase: the missile gap. American politicians, spurred by fear and limited intelligence, believed the Soviet Union had leapt ahead in the nuclear arms race. Khrushchev's speeches bragged of ICBMs being churned out like sausages. Western media repeated the claim. Pentagon war planners predicted hundreds of silos hidden across the Soviet tundra, ready to strike American cities with only minutes' notice. The assumptions were baked into budgets, into doctrine, into nightmares. By 1956, the U.S. Strategic Air Command had built its entire posture around a worst-case scenario. A surprise Soviet missile strike could annihilate American retaliatory capability before a single B-52 got off the ground. But inside the newly formed CIA, a handful of analysts weren't convinced. They noticed inconsistencies. The Soviet test schedule didn't support large-scale deployment. Recon photos from peripheral Soviet territories showed no missile-associated infrastructure, and intercepted communications, though sparse, hinted at delays, not mass production. They needed to know the truth. But traditional espionage couldn't reach Soviet missile fields. Human sources were limited. Diplomatic channels were flooded with misinformation, and the NSA's SIGINT operations couldn't penetrate the Soviet heartland. There was only one option: fly over it. But that meant breaking international law, violating Soviet airspace, risking war. The proposal reached President Eisenhower's desk, wrapped in contingency plans, diplomatic risk assessments, and a single promise: the U-2 would fly so high no one could stop it. It was a gamble Eisenhower reluctantly approved. The room of wrong assumptions was crowded that year. Generals who feared annihilation, politicians who demanded action, journalists who fueled the fear, and Soviet propagandists who leaned into the bluff. But as the first U-2 rose into the stratosphere and crossed the Iron Curtain, a quiet revolution began. One that would soon obliterate guesswork and myth. One that would replace fear with facts and paranoia with photographs. The missile gap was about to meet its reckoning. And in doing so, it would expose not just Soviet exaggeration, but America's own addiction to fear. For over a decade, Soviet air defense doctrine was engineered around one belief: air power could be defeated by layers of firepower. The system they built was intricate, lethal, and relentless. At its core was the PVO Strany, the Soviet Air Defense Forces, a standalone military branch equipped with cutting-edge radar installations, SAM batteries, and interceptor wings. They had fought for every ruble of funding and every square mile of radar coverage, and by the mid-1952, they believed they had built a near impenetrable shield. The doctrine itself was simple, brutal, and effective on paper. First came early warning. Long-range radars, such as the P-14 Tall King or P-35 Barlock, would detect incoming intrusions hundreds of kilometers out. Then came target acquisition and tracking, using mobile radar arrays to zero in on flight paths. Finally, interceptors like the MiG-17 and the faster MiG-19 would be scrambled to intercept, guided to the intruder by ground control. And if the planes got through, surface-to-air missile batteries, particularly the deadly SA-2 Guideline, stood ready. It was a missile designed to kill from miles away, tested successfully against high-altitude targets. The Soviets believed the system was airtight. No aircraft, they thought, could survive sustained exposure to it, let alone cross the Soviet heartland. But what they hadn't anticipated was altitude. The U-2 wasn't faster than a MiG. It wasn't stealthier than a bomber. But it could cruise at 70,000 feet, nearly 20,000 feet above the ceiling of most known interceptors. Worse, at that height, its slender profile and minimal radar cross-section made it almost invisible to the Soviet detection grid. In test after test, PVO radar crews failed to track simulated targets at those altitudes. Their SAMs couldn't lock. Their interceptors stalled long before reaching the U-2's flight level. Soviet doctrine had prepared for fast, medium-altitude threats, nuclear bombers from NATO bases. It had not prepared for a silent reconnaissance aircraft that flew at the edge of the sky. Even worse, Soviet leaders didn't know this. They believed in the strength of their system. Their textbooks said the airspace was defended. Their simulations confirmed it. So when the U-2 began flying, undetected and unchallenged, the doctrine didn't adapt. It collapsed, but no one admitted it yet. The illusion of control remained intact, and that illusion was about to be shattered by a series of black and white photographs that showed the world what the Soviet Air Force couldn't see. The 4th of July 1956. While Americans celebrated Independence Day with parades and fireworks, a different kind of declaration was unfolding in total secrecy 35,000 feet higher than any known battlefield. At 5:54 a.m. local time, a sleek black aircraft crossed into Soviet airspace near Leningrad. It had no weapons, no escort, no defenses. But what it carried was more dangerous than bombs. A 24-inch focal-length camera capable of capturing every inch of ground below it in stunning detail. Film that would soon reveal what Soviet secrecy had worked so hard to conceal. The U-2 had entered the Soviet Union. For over 8 hours, it flew unchallenged across Soviet airspace, photographing naval yards, missile ranges, airfields, and suspected nuclear facilities. The aircraft passed over Moscow itself, bold, exposed, and yet completely unreachable. On the ground, Soviet radar crews were flailing. At first, they mistook the blips for high-altitude weather balloons. Then panic set in. Orders came to scramble interceptors. MiG-17 seconds and MiG-19 seconds clawed their way into the upper atmosphere but stalled thousands of feet below their quarry. The pilots radioed back the impossible. "We see it. We can't reach it." Surface-to-air missile units were activated next. But the early models of the SA-2 were still being calibrated for high-speed bomber targets. Against the U-2's slow, gliding profile at 70,000 feet, their targeting systems locked on and then drifted off. Back in Langley, CIA engineers monitored mission telemetry in near silence. The aircraft had completed its route. It had seen what no Western eyes had seen since the Iron Curtain fell. It turned westward and exited Soviet airspace without a single shot fired. The photographs developed later stunned U.S. intelligence. The touted ICBM fields, mostly construction sites and test stands, the supposed missile grid of eastern Russia, exaggerated and scattered. The Soviet radar coverage, full of holes. One flight had demolished years of guesswork. But in the Kremlin, the response was different. Soviet leaders were not stunned. They were humiliated. Because for the first time in modern military history, a hostile power had flown over their most sensitive military infrastructure, and they had done absolutely nothing to stop it. No kill. No scramble success. Not even a radar lock. It wasn't just a reconnaissance mission. It was a strategic slap across the face of the Soviet military. And it wouldn't be the last. In the bowels of the Kremlin, when the initial reports filtered in high-altitude intrusion, radar interference, photographic overflights, there was one shared response: denial. The Soviet General Staff insisted it couldn't be real. A manned aircraft flying at such an altitude for hours over Soviet territory without interception was, by their standards, physically impossible. It had to be a hoax, a weather balloon, an electronic trick. Marshal Sergei Biryuzov, head of Soviet Air Defense Forces, dismissed the incursion outright. No aircraft can do this. Our defenses would have stopped it. His staff echoed the claim. They presented radar logs conveniently scrubbed of anomalies and assured the Politburo that all sectors were secure. But the truth was harder to bury than expected. The CIA, emboldened by the success of the July 4 mission, launched more flights. Each one took a different path: Kazakhstan, the Urals, the Baltic coast, collecting swaths of images, each sharper than the last. Dozens of Soviet military installations were photographed in complete detail. And then the worst blow: Western analysts began publishing estimates based on the findings. Public reports suddenly undercut Soviet military claims. Western newspapers speculated accurately that the USSR had far fewer operational missiles than it claimed. Satellite imagery hadn't revealed this. Intercepted radio traffic hadn't cracked it. The only source was a spy plane that no one could stop. Khrushchev, furious and embarrassed, demanded answers. He summoned generals, engineers, and air defense commanders into brutal sessions. "We are being watched," he thundered, "and you are blind." Soviet air defense officials insisted that improvements were underway. New missile sites were being reinforced. Interceptors would soon be equipped with high-altitude missiles. Radar resolution was being upgraded, but behind the confidence, fear was setting in. Because the problem wasn't just technical, it was strategic blindness. Their adversary had built a weapon not to destroy, but to expose. And there was no counterattack that could undo what the U-2 had revealed. Still, the Soviet Union couldn't afford to show weakness. Publicly, the flights were ignored. The existence of the U-2 was never acknowledged. News of overflights was labeled Western propaganda. And within the halls of power, anyone who dared suggest that the Americans were seeing more than they should was silenced or reassigned. But silence didn't erase the truth, because the camera's lens couldn't be argued with, and every photo brought another secret into the light. Moscow didn't believe it, until it had no choice. With the overflights increasing and photographic evidence piling up in American hands, Soviet military thinkers scrambled to explain how a slow-moving reconnaissance aircraft could consistently penetrate their most secure airspace. Their answer? Electronic camouflage. They convinced themselves that the U-2 wasn't flying that high, it was simply disguising its true altitude with advanced deception. Soviet scientists proposed that the Americans had developed a form of altitude spoofing, ECM, tricking radar systems into underestimating the U-2's height and speed. This theory became gospel inside Soviet radar command. Rather than confront the limitations of their own technology, they restructured training manuals and retooled radar calibration protocols. New radar filter algorithms were rushed into development. Technicians were ordered to double-check every blip above 60,000 feet. Phantom altitude became the scapegoat of every failure, but the reality was simpler and deadlier. There was no trick. The U-2 wasn't using jammers or stealth coatings or any complex spoofing system. It was simply flying where Soviet systems could not follow. The Soviet radar net was designed for speed, not altitude. Low and medium-level bombers were its primary concern. The P-12 spoon rest and P-15 flat-face radar systems couldn't reliably track targets above 65,000 feet, especially slow-moving ones that fell outside the expected velocity envelope. To radar operators, the U-2 appeared as momentary noise if it appeared at all. Still, the ECM theory persisted. Desperate for validation, Soviet engineers tested prototype aircraft with electronic jamming pods, only to find they disrupted friendly tracking systems more than enemy simulations. They wasted precious months chasing ghost technology, certain that the Americans had cracked some secret code of radar invisibility. Meanwhile, U-2 missions continued unchallenged. The longer the wrong theory lasted, the more entrenched it became. Soviet radar crews began blaming anomalies on signal masking, not technical deficiency. Missile batteries were repositioned based on imaginary interference zones. Aircraft patrol routes were adjusted to chase false leads generated by radar artifacts. It was a doctrinal mirage, and as the Soviets rewrote the rules of radar engagement around a fictional capability, the CIA collected more film. More missile bases were exposed. More strategic locations were mapped. The Americans didn't have to invent a new kind of warfare because the Soviets had invented the failure for them. The wrong theory was not just incorrect, it was exactly what the Americans needed it to be. As the phantom ECM explanation began to unravel, Soviet military leadership latched onto a new idea, one just as flawed, but far more convenient. The U-2 wasn't American, it was European. They theorized that the aircraft was being launched from West Germany or Turkey, possibly even Norway, and therefore, any breach of Soviet airspace was the responsibility of NATO, not Washington alone. This wasn't merely deflection, it was a calculated attempt to redirect strategic focus and political blame. If the overflights could be blamed on NATO's forward-deployed assets, then the Soviet response could be targeted geographically. Radar nets were thickened along western borders. MiG squadrons were reassigned to patrol areas near the Iron Curtain. SAM placements shifted to cover shorter response corridors, but all of it missed the truth. Because the U-2 wasn't being launched from NATO Europe, its missions were flown from Groom Lake, Pakistan, and later Norway, yes, but under CIA operational command, not military. The logistics were complex, compartmentalized, and globally dispersed. U.S. intelligence had mastered the art of plausible deniability, and the Soviets bought it. Entire Soviet briefings began to focus on NATO collusion. Generals spoke of Western alliances forming aerial strike corridors through Turkey and Iran. Naval intelligence flagged American aircraft carriers in the Mediterranean as potential U-2 launch sites. Soviet propaganda began to issue thinly veiled threats against NATO members, warning of retaliation for violations of our sacred skies. But the CIA was already ahead of the curve. By the time Soviet focus had zeroed in on Turkey and Central Europe, the U-2 seconds were launching from Peshawar, Pakistan, and recovering in Bodo, Norway. The routing was brilliant, skirting Soviet radar dead zones, using mountainous terrain and gaps in radar coverage to remain undetected during ingress and egress. The Soviets never expected the Americans to base spy planes out of a neutral Muslim ally. They never imagined the collaboration could stretch that far from European airspace, and so they calibrated their entire response to an attack vector that didn't exist. New fighter squadrons deployed to the wrong front. SAM sites were fortified along western ridges while the real penetrations happened from the south. Soviet airspace was locked tight but on the wrong side. The second wrong theory had now infected policy, not just perception. And the U-2 seconds kept flying, photographing missile sites, tracking radar patterns, uncovering deception. Not because they were invisible, but because their enemy was looking the other way. By late 1959, the CIA had flown 24 U-2 missions over Soviet territory. Each one brought back thousands of high-resolution images, exposing not only missile silos and airfields, but entire sectors of Soviet infrastructure, previously invisible to the West. But the most devastating discovery wasn't about location. It was about quantity. For years, U.S. politicians and military planners had feared that the USSR had already stockpiled hundreds of intercontinental ballistic missiles, capable of overwhelming America's defenses in a single first strike. This fear, the so-called missile gap, had dominated presidential debates, driven military spending, and reshaped strategic doctrine. But the U-2 films told a radically different story. Image analysts at the National Photographic Interpretation Center pored over the data frame by frame. What they found was conclusive. The Soviets had fewer than 24 operational ICBMs. Of those, only a handful were on alert at any given time. Many of the launch sites were incomplete, under construction, or test-only facilities. This wasn't a superpower ready to launch a surprise attack. It was a bluff. Khrushchev's speeches about missiles rolling off assembly lines like sausages were revealed for what they were: propaganda to mask weakness. The ramifications were seismic. President Eisenhower, briefed on the U-2's findings, immediately began pushing back against hawks in the Pentagon who wanted to expand the U.S. nuclear arsenal. He now had the proof to resist escalation. The panic over the missile gap was replaced with cold, rational certainty. America was ahead, not just technologically but strategically, yet not everyone was ready to accept it. Inside the military-industrial complex, contractors and generals alike resisted the findings. Accepting the truth meant scaling back programs, slashing budgets, and undermining arguments for expanded deterrence. Some officials even questioned the U-2 data until secondary flights confirmed it again and again. Even within the Soviet Union, the truth became impossible to suppress. Captured through stolen imagery, their illusion of parity had been shattered. Western analysts could now map their launch networks, time their satellite construction cycles, and even predict their missile production capacity down to factory output. Every secret revealed widened the intelligence chasm. The most ironic failure? The Soviet Union had succeeded too well in its deception. Their fake missile superiority had not only fooled the West but had boxed themselves into an arms race they couldn't actually fight. The U-2 had delivered more than images. It had detonated the illusion of Soviet military invincibility. Without dropping a single bomb, it caused an intelligence collapse from which the Kremlin would never fully recover. To the Soviets, the U-2 seemed like a miracle machine, an aircraft that defied interception, exposed their secrets, and humiliated their leadership. But what they misunderstood was that the plane itself wasn't the most dangerous part. The U-2 was merely the spear point. What followed behind it was a layered, coordinated, and nearly invisible ecosystem of intelligence collection, analysis, and action. It was a machine of machines, and it was American. First, there was logistics and basing. The U-2 required highly classified global staging points. In Peshawar, Pakistan, an airstrip once used by the British Empire became a CIA launch pad. In Norway, recovery crews waited in silence, their runway lights dark until the last second. These weren't military bases, they were geopolitical chess pieces, carefully negotiated and doubly deniable. Next came mission planning orchestration, conducted not by fighter pilots, but by mathematicians and analysts. Flight profiles were crafted down to the meter. Altitudes, angles, and wind vectors were calculated to avoid detection windows. Soviet radar coverage was mapped using intercepted signals and topographical modeling. These weren't flyovers, they were operations with surgical precision. Then, the aircraft itself. The U-2 was designed not for speed, but for height and endurance. Its massive wingspan and glider-like form let it drift above 70,000 feet for more than 9 hours. But its true power lay in the optics. At the heart of its fuselage was a camera system so advanced It could photograph a missile silo from 13 miles up and resolve objects the size of a soda can. Film cartridges were swapped mid-mission with automated reels, no human intervention required. But intelligence means nothing without interpretation. That's where the National Photographic Interpretation Center came in. Hidden in downtown Washington, D.C., this unassuming building was packed with analysts trained to read shadows, compare launch pads, identify vehicle tracks, and track infrastructure growth over time. One analyst could spend a week on a single image. But by the time their report reached Langley, the data was already in the hands of the President, the Pentagon, and U.S. allies. It was more than surveillance. It was time travel. The U.S. could now see what the Soviets built, when they built it, and most importantly, what they were pretending to build. Khrushchev's lies were no longer diplomatic games. They were quantifiable. And when U-2 flights were grounded, Corona satellites picked up the slack. Even as Francis Gary Powers' downing in 1960 ended high-altitude missions, space-based systems carried forward the same doctrine. Watch everything, miss nothing. The true American system wasn't just a plane. It was an architecture of omniscience, built not on firepower, but on facts. And the Soviets never saw it coming because they were still looking for weapons, not truth. The 1st of May 1960. Just as the Soviet Union prepared to celebrate International Workers' Day, a new U-2 flight lifted off from Peshawar, Pakistan. Its pilot, Francis Gary Powers, carried sealed orders to photograph missile facilities near Sverdlovsk and Plesetsk. The mission was routine by now. Too routine. But this time, the Soviets were ready. For months, Soviet engineers had been testing a revised variant of the SA-2 guideline missile, faster, more accurate, and capable of reaching the U-2's rarefied altitude. New radar arrays had been positioned to eliminate gaps. Interceptor patrols were coordinated to herd targets into missile kill zones. As Powers' aircraft entered Soviet airspace, the Soviets didn't just track it, they waited. At precisely 8:53 a.m., a salvo of SA-2 seconds launched from a site near Sverdlovsk. One of them exploded close enough to tear the U-2 apart midair. Powers ejected, parachuting into Soviet territory. Moscow had finally scored a kill. But the victory wasn't clean. Soviet SAM crews also downed one of their own MiG fighters during the intercept friendly fire in their desperation to hit an aircraft they still barely understood. Powers was captured. The plane was recovered mostly intact. The CIA had denied U-2 missions over the USSR just weeks earlier, but now that lie unraveled instantly. The Soviets showcased the wreckage, the camera equipment, and the pilot in a propaganda parade. And yet, for all the fireworks, the U.S. didn't blink. Eisenhower admitted the overflight openly, not out of embarrassment, but because the damage was already done. Everything the CIA had come to see, they had already seen. In the strategic balance, it wasn't the U-2 that failed. It was the Soviet deception campaign. For years, Moscow had claimed missile superiority. The U-2 had exposed the truth, and no amount of theatrical trial footage or wounded nationalism could erase what had already been photographed. What the Soviets didn't understand was that the U-2's true payload wasn't its camera. It was doubt. And by shooting it down, they confirmed it had seen something they desperately didn't want seen. The Powers incident torpedoed a U.S. Soviet summit scheduled in Paris. Khrushchev demanded apologies. Eisenhower refused. Trust disintegrated. But while diplomacy burned, American analysts back home were still reviewing thousands of undeveloped photos from previous U-2 flights. The Soviets won a tactical victory, but the Americans had already won the war for perception. The battlefield wasn't the sky, it was the narrative. And in that battle, every missile the Soviets launched at a spy plane was a public admission. They had something to hide. The downing of the U-2 was supposed to be a Soviet triumph, a chance to flip the narrative, to prove the USSR could strike back against Western arrogance. And for a brief moment, it worked. Soviet newspapers blared headlines. Khrushchev stood before packed halls declaring the invincibility of Soviet airspace. The pilot, Powers, was paraded not as a war trophy, but as living proof that the West had trespassed. But behind the scenes, the cracks were growing, widening into fractures neither Soviet radar nor propaganda could conceal. Because the real legacy of the U-2 wasn't the incident, it was the photographs. By 1961, U.S. strategic doctrine had been rewritten based on evidence, not fear. The mythical missile gap evaporated. Budget proposals invoking Soviet ICBM supremacy were rejected in Congress. War planners now understood Soviet capabilities for what they truly were: severely limited, overstated, and stretched thin across a vast and vulnerable geography. Worse still for Moscow, the U-2 had exposed not just their weapons but their worldview. Their entire defense system had been built on the assumption that secrecy equaled security. But the CIA had punctured that veil with a camera and a glider. Every radar upgrade, every SAM site, every airfield movement photographed, catalogued, analyzed. The illusion of Soviet military dominance crucial to its international leverage had been shattered. And as if that wasn't enough, a new threat loomed above: satellites. The U-2 was never meant to be permanent. From the beginning, it was a stopgap, a bridge to a system that wouldn't just fly over Soviet airspace, but orbit above it, constantly, without needing permission or protection. The Corona program would pick up where the U-2 left off, and with it came something even more dangerous: persistent surveillance. Khrushchev knew it. His generals knew it. No doctrine, no wall of jamming, no SAM battery could stop space. The U-2 had proven the concept. The satellite would finish the job. Strategically, the USSR had lost more than control of its skies. It had lost its mystique. The Western world now saw the Soviet Union not as an unstoppable war machine, but as a state bluffing behind shadows and silence. And ideologically, it was even worse. Because once exposed, the myth of Soviet invincibility couldn't be rebuilt. Not with missiles, not with speeches, not even with nukes. The U-2 had shown the world what fear had hidden, and for the Soviet Union, truth was the deadliest weapon of all. Long after the U-2 disappeared from Soviet skies, its shadow lingered in doctrine, in memory, in every satellite that crossed above. The Soviets never forgot it. Long before the age of drones and near-instant satellite imaging, the U-2 had pulled off what no weapon ever had. It had made the invisible visible, and in doing so, it had changed the very definition of power. By the 1,980 seconds, newer platforms had taken its place. SR-71 seconds, keyhole satellites, even early stealth aircraft. But none had the same psychological impact. None had made the world admit that a camera, properly aimed and perfectly placed, could be more dangerous than a warhead. Even decades later, Russian military documents declassified after the Cold War revealed the depth of the humiliation. Entire volumes were devoted to U-2 flight paths, interception attempts, and radar failures. One internal memo simply read, "We were blind, and they knew it." In the West, the legacy took a different form. The U-2 lived on not just in museums or documentaries, but in the mindset it created. That intelligence, not firepower, could win battles before they were fought. That secrecy was no match for altitude, patience, and optics. That wars could be deterred with clarity. Today, the U-2 still flies modernized, digital, and still collecting secrets. And every time it ascends into the sky, it carries with it the ghost of the Cold War's most daring mission. Not a bombing raid, not a nuclear standoff, but a photograph taken at 70,000 feet over a country that swore it couldn't be done. The Soviet Union mocked what it didn't understand, and by the time they understood it, it was already too late.